So today we're going to hear from John Frangos, who's the Principal Toxicologist and Risk Assessor for CDM Smith. John Frangos is a Fellow of the Australian College of Toxicology and Risk Assessment and a Diplomat of the American Board of Toxicology. He has 25 years of experience in occupational and environmental toxicology and is currently Principal Consultant at CDM Smith, where he provides toxicology and health risk assessment services to government and industry. This is a really exciting and important emerging area for cancer councils to be working in around occupational and environmental cancers, and we're really thrilled that we were able to borrow a guest speaker who's been here for a conference that's being held in Perth around occupational hygiene. So very opportunistic of us, and we're pleased John was able to agree. So please join me in welcoming John Frangos.
Good afternoon, all, and thank you, Melissa, for the invitation to come and speak. It's a great pleasure to do so. One of the things that I did in my past is run a company, and I got out of that because it took me away from the toxicology, which I really enjoy doing, and also like talking about. So. What I intend to do today is to go through some basic principles and concepts and then look at some case studies in terms of carcinogens and really just to highlight those some of the circumstances that are important in terms of occupational cancers, because there's obviously not enough time to do this in a very thorough way. So and then. While I'm doing that, I'll talk about controls, but and also finish up on some thoughts around controls. Toxicology, the science of poisons. You know, toxicology in the ancient world started with the doctor of medicine. In Kos in Greece, which is where my mum's from, by the way, with the Hippocrates, and since then, more recently, in the Middle Ages, it was used by, it was taken up by a rich widower who developed a product made of arsenic. As a product intended for rich, young, recently married women, and the arsenic product was used to turn them into rich, young widowers with arsenic, and obviously developed from there. But in the modern sense. As you'll see, we use that information in order to try and create safe workplaces. So toxicology is about determining the effects of chemicals on living things. And once we understand this, what those effects are, we can try and understand how the effects occur and then determine what we call doses required to cause the effects. So we separate things out into two categories. We call them hazards, and this is the first thing that we need to do. We need to determine what the effects of chemicals are to the human body. And once we've done that, we can then look at the risk, which is about what are the circumstances required for that chemical to manifest that health effect to the human body. And so they're the two things that we focus on. There are others. But what is a poison? And this phrase was phrased by Paracelsus in 1567, who's also known as the father of toxicology. And he said that all substances are poisons. There is none which is not a poison. The dose determines the poison. The right dose differentiates a poison and a remedy. And if my history says, and my mind serves me correct, Paracelsus was also the person who used mercury to treat syphilis. So we see two things in this sentence. All substances are poison. All chemicals have adverse health effects. The dose determines the poison. There are circumstances required in order for it to be a poison. So we see hazard and risk coming out even in this statement. But it's not just the dose that makes the poison, it's also the person. So in a human population, there will be a variety of response. Most people will have what we would say is a normal response. So the adverse effects of chemicals are predictable in the main. But then we find that there are people who are very tolerant to chemical exposure, and then there are people who are very sensitive to chemical exposure. And that will depend on their health status, their age, a variety of different environmental and genetic factors. In summary, there's no such thing as a safe chemical, only safe ways of handling chemicals. And this is one of the key messages that we give to workers when we're doing training in and around toxicology. There's no such thing as a zero risk, but we can minimise risk. So a couple of things, words that we use commonly is acute and chronic. Now, acute are effects, adverse health effects to the human body that are chemical causes that occur immediately or shortly after exposure, usually a high concentration exposure. Now, what this means is that we're talking about things where, for instance, air pollution occurs on a particular day, and the effects of that air pollution are apparent within 24 hours. Or someone incidentally is exposed to a pesticide and gets immediately sick as a consequence of that. That adverse health effect might be delayed for several hours, or 12 hours in certain cases, but the time frame over which these effects occur are short, and so that's what we categorise them as acute. The high concentration exposure is relative. It's relative to chronic. So what we tend to find with chronic, which is defined as effects occurring sometime after exposure, or effects occurring over a long period of time to small concentrations. And cancer is an example of this, which we'll be talking about today. So it usually requires repeated and prolonged exposure. Now, we also talk about reversible and irreversible effects. So reversible effects are temporary changes in function of an organ or system which returns to normal on removal of a chemical. So, we can have a temporary effect on the respiratory tract, which is recoverable. For instance, a bronchitis, or an irritation of the nose, irritation of the eyes, and that is a reversible effect. Once the exposure is removed, the body can respond, adapt, and repair. An irreversible effect is a permanent change. So, in function of an organ or a system which does not return to normal or on removal of the chemical. And this can be a variety of things, and as it says, typically organ damage. So in terms of the lung, it can be the development of scar tissue in the breathing parts of the lung. So just as we sprain our ankle, and then after we feel restriction in the ankle because of the scarring, the same thing can happen after inflammation of the lungs and result in irreversible damage to parts of the lungs. And this we term fibrosis, but effectively it's a type of scarring of the lungs. And that's an example of an irreversible effect. So reversible versus irreversible are important terms. Acute versus chronic is also important. The third set of terms that I'd like you to be thinking about is whether it's a local effect or a systemic effect. Some chemicals cause effects at the site of contact. So some chemicals cause lung cancer because that's the first point of entry to the human body. Some chemicals cause stomach cancer because, again, that is the first point of entry if the chemical is ingested. Some chemicals, of course, can cause corrosion. So, acids and alkalis, when they're in touch with the skin, will cause a burn, necrosis of the skin. And so we find that these sort of effects are called localized. And systemic effects are those related to the internal body. So damage or ill health effect occurs at body systems or organs remote from the contact site. So substances are absorbed and distributed. Again, technical terms which basically mean that the chemical gets into the body. So if it gets in via the lungs, it gets to the parts of the lungs which is in contact with the bloodstream. They get taken up into the bloodstream, delivered to the liver, and then transported around the rest of the body. One of the things that toxicologists have had to address in the course of their work, particularly in the 20th century, and this is I guess another topic which is a good one to dwell on with the development of toxicology tests through the 20th century, is that we're often dealing with trying to interpret information from animal toxicity studies. And the environment in which animal toxicity studies occur are typically at higher doses. So because you're limited in the number of samples that you will have, so the number of animals that will be used in that study. And so you need to increase the doses to maximize the chance of seeing an effect, and also to be able to demonstrate a range of effects so that you can draw what we call a dose-response curve. So I guess I've used the word dose a number of times and haven't defined it yet, but dose versus concentration is something that we need to be careful of. So a dose is the amount of a chemical that is administered or that is taken into the body. A concentration is the amount of the chemical in air, in our surroundings. So the dose is a little bit different to the concentration. When we're talking about things that cause toxicity via intake of air, we normally describe them as concentration, and you'll hear the words ppm or ppb. Whereas when we're talking about food or chemicals taken up via ingestion, we talk about milligrams per kilogram body weight. So we express it as a function of a body weight. Reason we do that is because we are trying to extrapolate from animal studies commonly, and so we need to standardise our terms in terms of the amount of chemical that enters the body. But this is the biggest. A lot of time they spent trying to deal with that big question mark in the middle is how can we relate the high dose animal experiments to low dose human exposures. Having a chemical in the environment doesn't necessarily mean that there will be an exposure. So an exposure is when a chemical goes from the environment, whether it's a workplace or general environment, into the body at the point of entry. So the routes of entry are important for us to understand. And in workplace situations, inhalation exposure and skin exposure are the main routes of exposure. So in doing risk assessment, we are constantly looking at the source. Where is this chemical coming from? How does it get to the person? And then looking at what are the adverse effects in the circumstances, in the way in which it is presented to the person and then enters the person via the route of exposure. And this is why we then also subcategorize things, whether it's an acute exposure, a chronic exposure, a site of contact effect, a systemic effect, and whether the effect is reversible or irreversible. So cancer, in a very, very blunt way of thinking about it, is unrestrained cell change. And there are steps involved in the cancer process. There's an initiation stage, a promotion stage, a progression stage. So cancer development is a multi-step process. And I guess when we think about it in terms of a chemical, we also need to be thinking about what is it that the chemical adds in that multi-stage process. But we'll come back to that. So what is a tumour? A tumour is a Latin word for swelling, to swell. A tumour is a tissue mass formed as a result of abnormal, altered, inappropriate rates of cell growth or cell death, the growth of which continues indefinitely. So there's a change in that cell's purpose or control, and regardless of the mechanisms that control normal cell division. So we see this theme that the cells are out of control. But the cancer can be benign or malignant. So a carcinogen is something that causes cancer. And when it comes to chemicals, we generally don't distinguish whether the cancer is benign or malignant when categorizing it or defining the hazard of a chemical. So a carcinogen is simply a substance that can cause cancer by inhalation, ingestion, or skin contact. With regards to workplace exposure, you see that it defines it in terms of its exposure route. So a more technical definition for a carcinogen, so a cancer-causing chemical, a technical term, carcinogen, is a chemical capable of inducing neoplasms, whether they're benign or malignant. And we see that if we were to look at this in a technical sense, and the reason I've put this together is so you get an idea of what they're doing at an agency like the International Agency for Research on Cancer. They're looking at these fine details. They're looking at does the induction, the types of tumours, does it induce types of tumours not seen in controls? So if we have an animal experiment and a group of control animals, are we seeing tumours that are not seen in controls? Now that's a clear signal that something's going on in relation to the chemical. We also look at increases in incidence of the tumour types seen in controls. So if we get lung cancer in the control animals, are we seeing those same lung cancers but at higher incidences in the animals that have been exposed to a chemical? So induces the development of tumours earlier than in controls. Sometimes in these animal experiments you see tumours occurring within 6 months. And remembering rats and mice generally live for about 2 years. The experiments go for about 2 years, their whole lifetime, from when they're weaned until their death. And so if we're seeing those tumours early on in the experiment, again, that's a clear signal that something's different. Increased multiplicity of tumours. Lots and lots of different tumours in different organ systems, more so than in the controls. A dose response, so as you increase the dose, you increase the effect, you increase the number of cancers in each of the groups. Again, another clear signal that the chemical is the cause of the cancers. Similar effects in different species. This is important because sometimes the biochemistry of a rat is different to that of a human. So if we're seeing something in, say, male rats, which we don't see in female rats or male or female mice, and perhaps another species that's been tested, then we start to ask questions, is there something different about male rats? And there are a number of chemicals which we categorise as species-specific carcinogen. So it causes a protein change in a rat kidney, for instance, but that protein change doesn't occur in humans. So you see now why you need different groups for categorising carcinogens. So this is why it's not just it causes cancer in humans or it doesn't cause cancer in humans. It's because a lot of the information comes from animal studies. The other thing that I haven't spoken about, which is, I think it needs a couple of hours, is the human studies that occur. And I'll try and bring some of that out during the case studies. So the human studies also require interpretation, and they're not always easy to interpret. So we categorise things at the International Agency for Research on Cancer into 5 groups. The first group is definitely causes cancer in humans. So there's a causal relationship between the chemical exposure and cancer in humans. Typically, you need a human study to put yourself into this category. Group 2A probably causes cancer in humans. This is typically for chemicals that have clear signals. You know, they've met the requirements of that previous slide. The animal studies are clear that this is a carcinogen, a cancer-causing chemical, and there's no reason to suspect that that information is not relevant to humans. And then we get into group 2B, which is a little bit more difficult. So we may have a little bit of human information, we may have animal studies, but we're not sure whether the doses and the circumstances of exposure or whether the test systems that were used were actually relevant to humans. And for these, we still call them possibly causing cancer in humans, but we separate them out. And from a scientific point of view, if you think about it, it's really important to do this because we want to be able to say, we're not sure about this, so that more studies will be done in order to either become more sure that it's a carcinogen or put it into group 4, which is does not cause cancer in humans, to rule it out. Group 3 is we don't have enough evidence to decide. Either the tests aren't there or the tests are there but they're equivocal, and it's very hard to decide whether it's possibly or does not. So there are a number of schemes that categorise chemical carcinogens. The one that we use in workplaces in Australia is called the Global Harmonised System for Classifying Chemical Substances. And there are detailed criteria for their classification. Now, in the fine detail, there are differences between agencies. So there is a different emphasis between the International Agency for Research on Cancer versus the GHS in how some of the evidence is weighed and how some of that evidence is treated. And as a consequence, we end up with different groupings for the same chemical. You may have noticed, for instance, not that we're going to be talking about that today, luckily, is for glyphosate. Glyphosate is categorised by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a Category 1, as a Group 1 carcinogen. Whereas most other agencies around the world, the US EPA, the APVMA, etc., call it equivalent to a Category 1B, which is presumed, or in IARC terms, a Category 2A. So we see differences in these classifications, and it relates to the rules that are used in the classification. So this is just a listing. Now, this looks very linear because it's a table, but in fact, it's not always a linear comparison. So if you go across the rows, you see GHS, IARC, the two that we've spoken about, and one in the GHS is two categories. It's 1A and 1B, whereas in IARC it's 1. So, and then IARC used the term 2, and then they use 2A and 2B. This can be confusing to people, but you can see there's a variety of different schemes, and all of them, most of them weigh data differently. So, for instance, the US National Toxicology Program have two categories, and the European Union now uses the GHS. This is an older slide, but they used to have three categories. So now we've moved to effectively four categories, and the ACGOH has five categories. And again, their categories and groupings and rules associated with their groupings have different rules to IARC, which causes confusion. So workplace cancers, the most common are mesothelioma related to asbestos, and then lung cancer is of growing concern, particularly in relation to silica, crystalline silica, and diesel exhaust. And we'll talk about diesel exhaust today. Acute myeloid leukemia is another one, or just generally leukemia, and that's related to benzene exposure. And the other one I'm going to talk to you today about is liver angiosarcoma, which is a very rare tumour, but it is the consequence of vinyl chloride exposure. So vinyl chloride, and again, I'm not going. It's beyond the time available, and to go through in detail all of the aspects of vinyl chloride carcinogenesis. But I just wanted to highlight a number of different things for each of the case studies. So for vinyl chloride, remember vinyl chloride is the starting chemical for making PVC. Obviously since after the war in the 1950s, vinyl chloride use accelerated, and it's a very common chemical, PVC, these days. So in April 1975, some 20 years after it was first manufactured, it was found that VC and PVC production plants had to reduce their time-weighted average workplace exposure levels from 500 ppm to 1 ppm to provide adequate worker protection. The reason for this is that in 1974, in the late 1960s to the early 1970s, in a US plant, in two US plants that manufactured PVC, they identified that a small amount of workers had liver angiosarcoma. Now, this liver angiosarcoma in humans is a very rare disease. In fact, I think there's only in the order of about 200 registered cases. But it is one of these distinct cancers which go onto the registry. So if someone dies of this liver angiosarcoma, it's actually recorded. And so an occupational physician observing a liver angiosarcoma would have been quite stark and apparent, and in fact this is what happened. As a consequence, vinyl chloride at around the same time, whether I'm not sure the exact sequence, whether it was identified in the factory first and then the animal toxicity studies were done, but at around that same time, animal toxicity studies were done, and guess what? It caused cancer in the animals as well. As a consequence, the occupational exposure standard went down from 500 to 1 ppm. Before that, vinyl chloride was treated as a general hydrocarbon, Now, general hydrocarbons, in terms of their adverse health effects, are thought to cause what we technically call central nervous system depression. And most of you will know what central nervous system depression if you've had a few drinks of alcohol. So central nervous system depression starts with a feeling of euphoria, and then dizziness, and then I presume all of you know what the effects are after that, but they get more severe up to coma and death. So that's what they thought they were dealing with, and they occur. They're, as we said, acute effects that occur at high concentrations. So irreversible systemic effects had not been identified for vinyl chloride. And you might ask, well, why does vinyl chloride cause cancer? And why does it cause a specific cancer? So it causes a cancer that affects a blood vessel in the liver. The reason is that vinyl chloride is a reactive chemical, and it quickly enters the liver from the bloodstream, and in the liver, and the purpose of the liver with relation to chemicals is to try and break them down into a form which is easier for the body to excrete via the urine. And this is what the liver intends to do with vinyl chloride and what it does for vinyl chloride. But in the process of doing that, it forms a reactive intermediate, we call intermediate, being another chemical that is formed by a chemical reaction with an enzyme, an oxidation process, and that enzyme and that process results in a very reactive chemical which can bind to proteins, and in this case, a genetic material, and that event is an irreversible event, which leads to initiation, and then promotion, and then a progression. So the formation of a neoplasm over a long period of time. So at the time when vinyl chloride exposure standard went from 500 to 1 ppm in the United States, the factory said, we can't do this, we're going to have to close down. It's technically not feasible. However, we still have PVC, so they worked it out, the engineers. And this is often a conversation between toxicologists and chemists and engineers, is when we come up with a new standard, the chemists say, no, you can't have that standard, it's below the detection limit. And we say, well, go and find a new detection limit. Work it out. And the same with engineers. And I've had these experiences in working for a chemical company where you come up with an exposure standard and they say, well, it doesn't meet our engineering designs. And I say, well, change them. However, the good news story for vinyl chloride is that, well, the silver lining, if you like, is that after 1974, when the exposure standard was changed, there hasn't been a recorded case of liver hemangiosarcoma in workers. So if you started work after the engineering designs were changed and the exposure standards could be met in those factories, then a liver angiosarcoma hasn't been observed. So changing the exposure standard is an effective way to control carcinogens in the workplace. There's one more thing I should say before I move on, and that is the vinyl chloride is something that can directly affect DNA. So those sort of chemicals we call genotoxic, meaning that they can interact with the genome and cause toxicity, genotoxic. So genotoxic carcinogens tend to be treated as if they have no threshold. So there's no concentration or dose at which there is no risk. And this is quite difficult to explain and also to understand, because it doesn't necessarily mean that at all concentrations we will see liver angiosarcomas, as we've seen with vinyl chloride. There is actually a practical threshold. So the risk is still there, but it's a very low risk. And generally for cancers, we say for chemicals, if the risk is less than, in workers, 1 in 10,000 of developing a cancer, that risk is below that, below 1 in 10,000, is a low risk. And for the general population, we tend to use 1 in 100,000. So benzene, of course, is in gasoline. In the past, it was present at higher concentrations than it currently is. But it was also an industrial solvent, and it was used in shoemaking and in rubber production, and it still is in many processes, industrial processes. But keep in mind that about half of the benzene in the air that's breathed in is taken into the bloodstream. So about 50% is absorbed. Half of the absorbed benzene goes to the liver and bone marrow. They're the two main places it goes inside the body. So you'll remember from before that now we're talking about a chemical that causes systemic effects, not local effects. Benzene is broken down, metabolized in the liver and bone marrow. So before I was talking about vinyl chloride, and I said it gets broken down by the liver in order for it to be excreted in the urine. Well, in this case, the enzyme that breaks down benzene is also present in the bone marrow. And for some reason, benzene and the metabolites that are produced in the bone marrow are toxic to the blood system, the immature blood system components. And it's not just one, so it's not just the red blood cells, the immature red blood cells that are developing and being nurtured in the bone marrow. It's also the white blood cells and also the other blood components. So benzene tends to clog up the bone marrow with immature blood system components, which then leads to irreversible changes, which leads to an initiation process and then a progression towards a neoplasm, which in this case is leukemia. Benzene also causes acute effects. So again, that central nervous system depression that I was talking about before is common for organic solvents, and benzene is one such solvent. The CNS system effects occur over a short duration of exposure, and I'll show you what the significance of that is in a minute in terms of history. But the blood system effects occur over a short and long duration of exposure. So when I say blood system effects, if you were to take some blood from a worker from a shoe factory which has had high benzene exposure, you would see that the red blood cells and the white blood cells don't look normal, and their counts are different to normal. So that's an adverse effect in itself. But also linked to that, 5 to 15 years after the first exposure, we see benzene-induced leukemia. Now, again, benzene is genotoxic, but genotoxic in a slightly different way. Vinyl chloride attacks DNA, whereas benzene attacks at the chromosome level. So still genetic material, but different types of genetic material. And benzene-induced leukemia, in particular, it causes aplastic anemia. So you can see that after short-term effects, the central nervous system effects occur at about 50 ppm and higher, but the blood system effects occur at 7 ppm. And now I've put blood system effects in both categories, both short-term and chronic, because they can occur after a short exposure, and they can occur over a long-term exposure. But we see that about 7 ppm, you see these high blood system, and higher, you see blood system effects. Between 1 and 10 parts per million, which is again the concentration in air in the workplace's in the worker's breathing zone, you can see after plus many years of exposure, 5 to 15 years of exposure, you can see aplastic anemia. And so here you might get a feel for the distinction between concentration and exposure, and dose, I should say. So the dose for benzene, the cumulative dose that's required to cause cancer, is not just the 1 to 10 ppm, so it's not just the concentration, it's also the repeated exposure to that 1 to 10 ppm on a day-to-day basis for a number of years. So typically what you'll find if you're reading the scientific papers, when you have something like that, you'll see ppm dot years. It's because it means that it's the concentration times the number of years that's important. So duration of exposure as well as the concentration. So at less than 1 ppm, the evidence is scarce for increased leukemia, mortality among workers, potentially exposed to low levels of hydrocarbons and other petroleum products. And we have good data for that in Australia because the petroleum industry runs a worker study where it follows the health of their workers on an annual basis. And so we can categorise high exposure and low exposure workers. So for benzene, the atmospheric exposure standards, remember the breathing zone of a person, so this is the concentration in air. The standard went from, in 1946, 100 ppm, and it went down to 10 ppm in 1977. Notice again, we're talking about a 10, 15, 20-year gap between it being identified as something that causes acute effects over a short period of time that are reversible to something that was identified as causing chronic effects that were irreversible and life-threatening. And the US occupational exposure standard is 0.5 parts per million at present, as in Australia it's 1 parts per million. Now, importantly for benzene, because it's a confirmed human carcinogen, there is also a health surveillance requirement. So health surveillance typically involves either a blood test or a urine test or an annual check to check on the organ of interest. So in this case it would be a blood test to check blood system components to see whether the blood counts are normal and the blood cells are normal. So when we combine these two things, that is an annual health check with also a test to see whether we can observe the metabolites that we know are related to the toxicity of the compound in urine, or an exhaled breath test like we do for alcohol. Again, it's a measure of the exposure, the amount of exposure a person has, and it's a better measure than the concentration in the workplace air because it's the internal concentration that you're measuring. And so it gives you a better feel for the dose. So again, as we said for benzene, it's not just a matter of the concentration, but also the time frame. But we know that workers have unusual time frames of exposure too. We know that many mine workers, for instance, work 12-hour shifts. And we know that even though perhaps a workplace normally is able to meet an exposure standard in normal working stances, that people can be exposed to low ventilation areas, so the concentration's higher. And for benzene, it can also absorb through the skin. So if you're using rags to in and around that benzene has been present, and the rags are wet and they have some benzene on them and they're in contact with your skin, then you can also have exposure through the skin. So measuring internal concentrations via a urine test or a blood test gives us the total exposure to benzene. So health surveillance programs are very important for things like benzene. Diesel exhaust. So diesel exhaust emissions are more complex, and this is something that's more recent in terms of its identification as a carcinogen. So diesel exhaust is more complex because it's a complex set of chemicals that people are exposed to. And it's not just a single chemical like benzene and vinyl chloride, which you can neatly test in a set of animal experiments and neatly try and associate from a workplace the concentration and the adverse effect. So diesel exhaust emission is made up of gases, and the light blue circle there is the gases, and the pink circle there is particulate matter. You see sulfur dioxide is a gas, but it can also be present as sulfate particles. So that's why they've separated it out there. But particulate matter, PM, is what we tend to call dust in air, but it can also be aerosols in air. So that's why we call it particulate matter. And particulate matter can be, depending on its particle size, then also subcategorized. For diesel exhaust, the particle size is very tiny. So it's like smog. It can be ultrafine particles as well as fine particles, meaning that they're very, very tiny in comparison to other dust sources that we have. So diesel exhaust in 1988 was classified as a probable human carcinogen. This is because we had a series of human studies which were showing some signals in terms of cancer, but they weren't clear because the exposures weren't being... It's hard to measure or have a metric for exposure to diesel exhaust when it's coming from a variety of different sources and also different workplaces, and also when you have this complex mixture, because is there a common metric? And so if you think about a human study in a workplace, how are you going to correlate the exposure with the cancer that you're interested in? And if you have all of these variables to play with, it makes the correlation very difficult, because not only do you want to correlate it, you want to show that it is a correlation that isn't due to chance. So that there isn't a confounding factor, what we call a confounding factor, so another variable that is responsible for the cancer, that it is the diesel exhaust. And so this was, in 1988, the dilemma. But by 2012, the evidence was clear. There were two large studies that were done in the US, which was able to be used by the International Agency for Research on Cancer to recategorise it as a definite human carcinogen. The main concern is lung cancer, although there is some evidence for bladder cancer. In general, IARC considered that the more informative studies consistently show a positive association between exposure to diesel engine exhaust and the risk for lung cancer. Therefore, it is improbable that the observed association was caused by chance, bias, or confounding. So, here is another dilemma for us. Standards for diesel engines have changed. And you see on this graph, these bars on your left and my right, you'll see that there's big bars with the horizontal axis showing years, 1992, 1996, 1998 and 2000, right up to 2013. And the vertical axis, you'll see some numbers in terms of grams per kilowatt per hour. So it's the amount of diesel exhaust per kilowatt, so per engine power, or output. So you'll see that below the years, 1992, there's a term Euro 1, and then Euro 2, Euro 3, Euro 4, Euro 5. These are the different performance standards for diesel engines. And you see that as those performance standards have become tougher in Europe and the US, the engines have become cleaner in terms of their exhaust emissions. So you see overall the diesel exhaust's emissions have come down. But then if you look to your right, the second chart, you'll see that it breaks down the components which are present in diesel engine exhaust. So the gaseous components, NOx and CO, and the hydrocarbons, which are the particulates in the main. So these hydrocarbons, you'll see, have always been a relatively small proportion of the engine exhaust, but you'll see that they have reduced considerably between 1992 and 2013. However, the studies that were used in order to classify diesel engine exhaust are all based on engines that, or studies in workplaces where the exhaust was created from diesel engines that predated 1998. So one of the things you'll hear when experts are talking about diesel exhaust and cancer is whether the IARC evaluation is relevant to new diesel engines. But I think this is probably missing the mark a little. The IARC reclassification increases the importance of ensuring that diesel exhaust exposure is minimised. And so the fact that technology has decreased the engine emissions is great, and it should continue to strive to do that. And we need to also, in parallel to that, continue to use the studies that are available to develop an exposure standard based on the science. And at the moment, that's not the case. So the commonly used standard, it's not a standard, it's a guideline because it's produced by an institute and not the government, is set to protect against local, reversible, acute adverse effects and not chronic, irreversible adverse effects, so lung cancer. So if we were going to introduce a standard that protects against lung cancer, we would be choosing a much lower number than currently is being used. And I just remind the audience of the history and the reasons why I told you about benzene and vinyl chloride. It's the same thing. The finding that approximately, and also, and keep in mind, that there are approximately 1.2 million workers in Australia that are exposed to diesel exhaust, emphasising the importance of continued improvement in diesel engine exhaust performance standards. Now, coming towards the end of this, and how much time have we got? I can't see the clock. Melissa, have we got? I actually can't see it. I'm almost done. Okay. Look, asbestos, the reason I didn't want really to talk a lot about asbestos because it's commonly, there's good knowledge about asbestos compared to some of these other chemicals. What I would like to say very quickly in relation to asbestos is let's think about it in a different way, and that way you can think about fibres and dusts all in the same way of thinking about it. To us, technically, there's sort of two or three things that drive the toxicity of such things, and that is the size and shape and persistence of the dust or the fibre. So if the fibre is sharp, and that's sort of like inverted commas, and long, needle-like, like an asbestos fibre, but still small enough to enter the lungs, and it's biopersistent, meaning that the lungs can't remove it, then it's likely to be toxic. It's likely to be carcinogenic. And this is something we have learnt from our experience with relation to asbestos, but also to a large extent crystalline silica. The fact that the crystalline silica dust is biopersistent, that it stays and its shape makes it reactive in the lung, makes it able to cause scar tissue and to cause lung cancer. So, but keep in mind with asbestos and crystalline silica that when we're talking about crystalline silica, we're talking about sand at the beach. And with asbestos, it is present in nature, but at very low levels. So the frequency and the amount of exposure is also important, particularly when we're talking about whether cancer will manifest itself in a workplace. And also keeping in context also what I said earlier about vinyl chloride and this, although there's no threshold for it being present or causing cancers, there actually is a practical threshold. So in conclusion, what I would like you to think about is, with the case studies that we've gone through, is that you would have noticed that in the past, particularly when we're talking about benzene and vinyl chloride, we've had to wait for the adverse health effect to appear. We've had to then do tests to confirm that adverse health effect. So we're in the green box. Sorry, we're in the pink box. Does that appear as pink to you guys? Yeah, pink. And then, although both of them look pretty similar, the darker pink box is where we've been in the past. But where we want to be is to have healthy workers all the time. So in order to achieve that, we need to be in the lighter pink box, or purple. Not good with colours, sorry. It sort of looks blue on my screen here, but it looks more purple up there. So the lighter blue box. We want to be understanding our exposure circumstances. We want to be controlling a chemical at its source and the pathway before it gets to the receptor, the technical term sometimes you hear, or the person. And if we do that effectively, and we can avoid either subclinical disease or adverse health effects occurring. Now, this requires a better understanding of how a chemical interacts with the body in human circumstances. And so you'll see right at the right-hand side of the slide this thing with the heading 21st Century Tox Methods, which is about looking at cell tests, tests at the cell level, isolating cells from the lung, for instance, and looking whether chemicals can trigger a reaction in those cells, rather than exposing animals to the cell to the chemical for their entire lifetime. So there's a push in the 21st century to develop these tests sufficiently robustly so that they can be used in predicting and also managing workplace carcinogens. And with that, I will hand back to Melissa. Thank you.
I don't know about anybody else, but I was so sidetracked watching and listening that I didn't even look at my watch once. And so we've completely gone over time. So I think if you've got some questions, we can probably take them after the session, but I'm mindful people might just start streaming out now. So if you would like to leave, then please feel free. But if you do have a burning question, put your hand up now and we can ask it. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. We do have an evaluation form that we've given you when you arrived. If you could fill that out, that would be great. And we will have some more cancer update lectures next year. We're working on the topics, I believe, now, and we'll have more coming next year. So please check our website so that you're up to date with those as well. Or make sure you're on our email list so we can give you some advance notice. But thank you for coming today, and please join me again in thanking John for his presentation.